class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 13 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Edmonton Oilers, in which the Sharks have won 3-2. So suddenly, the Sharks now have back-to-back wins, something that would have been thought impossible just about a week ago, when instead of wins, the Sharks were stringing together back-to-back 10-goal-against performances. And so for a team that many thought was one of the worst teams that we have seen in the NHL as of late, while they do indeed still find themselves in that last place spot, they are not in sole possession of 32nd place. In fact, they now find themselves tied with the very same team that they beat tonight, the Edmonton Oilers, for that last place spot. And the fact that that was a possibility of happening here tonight with a regulation win for the San Jose Sharks actually did draw the attention of much of the hockey world. It was not just Sharks and Oilers fans watching these games, but many fans from around the league tuning in to see if indeed this Sharks team that everyone just saw let in 20 goals in 2 games could defeat an Oilers squad that just last year was a very strong contender in the Western Conference. That's hockey, how it goes sometimes. And when it comes to how this particular game played out, it was relatively successful for the Sharks. Don't get me wrong, of course, if you take a look at the scoreboard, the stats, you'll see that the Oilers heavily outshot the Sharks, had more chances than the San Jose Sharks, and you'll think, oh, this is a game in which they stole, and perhaps that is indeed the case, but that's likely going to be the case throughout the entirety of this 82 game seasons in the games that the Sharks do win. This is not exactly a roster that's built to dominate much of the league. It's not going to be able to just put teams in their place, put up 40 plus shots in a game, 5-6 goals. I doubt we will really ever see one of those extremely dominant victories from this Shark squad, and much of the wins that they are going to be getting this season are likely going to have the appearance of this Oilers game as well as the Flyers game from a couple of days ago. But this here tonight was one of the better Sharks performances. When it comes to bad teams, there are a few things that they can do to help improve their chances of winning night in, night out, and this was something that the Sharks were not doing at all through the first 11 games of the season, and that is primarily capitalizing on opponents' mistakes, getting some rush chances and making sure that you're able to get those in the net, as well as just burying the chances that you are just generally able to get, even if they are few and far between. Remember, this is the only second time this season in which the Sharks managed to score more than 2 goals in a game, with the 3 here tonight. And this starts off with a Zetterlund goal in the first period to make it 1-0 San Jose. And while this first period they did get somewhat outshot when it comes to just generally, it felt as though besides the Oilers' power play, the Sharks actually had a relatively competitive first period here with Edmonton. Once it came to the second period, they managed to tie the game up pretty fast. Just a couple of minutes in, it was Darnell Nurse to make it 1-1, but relatively soon after, Tomas Hertl would get a bit of a lucky bounce, something that the Sharks have been getting absolutely none of this season, so it was nice to see a bit of fortune go their way to make it 2-1, and that would be the score at the end of the second period. In the third period, for the second straight game, the Sharks would actually manage to get themselves a 2-goal lead, this one coming from Zadina, who we haven't really seen score in a while, to make it 3-1 San Jose. And then that lead persisted until the last couple of minutes of the game, where the Oilers would pull their goaltender and Nugent Hopkins would bring it to within 1. And even though the Oilers would then get a power play for themselves, allowing them to roll 6-on-4 for the last couple of minutes. And remember, the Oilers had a historically great power play last season, featuring players like Nugent Hopkins, but of course also the best player in the league, Connor McDavid, and one of the best players in the league, Leon Draisaitl. The Sharks managed to kill that off and finish up the game 3-2. So an impressive last couple of minutes to prevent the Oilers from getting that final game-tying goal. When it comes to the players to talk about here, there weren't really any changes, at least to the forward group for the San Jose Sharks. And we start off with the top line of Eklund, Hertl, and Zetterlund. First, let us talk about Hertl, who I was extremely impressed with in the previous game against Philly. I mentioned how he was very dominant on the ice for a good chunk of the shifts that he had in that game, and that continued here into this game, which is so important to mention, because one of the biggest issues with Tomas Hertl last season was that certain level of consistency. There was about like a dozen games last year where Hertl really showed up and played an exceptional game, but it was extremely, extremely rare for Hertl to then carry that momentum over into the following game. And yet he managed to do that here tonight. He was great against Philly. He was great again here against Edmonton, puts up even a couple of points in this one compared to last game as well. A great pass to Zetterlund, a nice, somewhat lucky goal, but still nice one for him to get. And it was just a good game for Hertl for sure. When it comes to his wingers, Eklund, a fantastic game for Eklund, one of the better forwards on the ice for the San Jose Sharks. He plays such a unique style where it's so easy to tell that it is indeed Eklund on the ice just by the way he carries himself, the way he skates, and the effort that he puts in every single shift. And I mentioned back in the preseason, one thing that I really noticed about Eklund, which was maybe a bit unexpected, was how strong he actually was on the penalty kill. And for whatever reason, at the beginning of the season, the Sharks did not utilize Eklund in a penalty killing role. Perhaps they wanted to keep him fresher for even strength and power play ice time play, but he excelled so much in that role that it feels as though it's a detriment to your own team, especially considering how bad the Sharks were on the penalty kill and have been on the penalty kill thus far, to not have him there. But over these last couple of games, he has been putting in that, being placed in that role, and he's been doing an admirable job here. As I mentioned early on, the Oilers have a very good power play. Even this season where they have been struggling, it is still a very efficient power play, and he did a great job at killing off when he was on the ice. And of course, the big highlight of the game perhaps for him was stripping McDavid of the puck near the neutral zone and managing to get a sort of partial breakaway. And while he does not end up actually scoring, the fact that he managed to take away the puck from the best player in the league in the position where he excels at the most, which is on the power play, is a testament to how good Eklund was indeed here tonight. Nice to see him get an assist on the Zetterlund goal as well. When it comes to Zetterlund in particular, the final player on this top line, I was a bit critical of Zetterlund's performance last game, talking about how he was kind of the weak link of that top line, didn't exactly complement the two other players, but here tonight he stepped up in a huge way. Zetterlund was very, very effective on this top line, and even in other positions where he found himself, not exactly double shifting, but perhaps like in the middle of line changes. And so this first line went from like a 7 on 10 to like a 9 on 10 here tonight. This is probably the first line in this entire season for the San Jose Sharks that actually managed to have consistent cycles in the offensive zone on like every other shift that they actually got. So that was very good to see, and it's the type of chemistry that the Sharks have been waiting to find from any of their forwards through the first 13 games of this season. When it comes to the second line, this is where David Quinn actually made a couple of swaps throughout this game. One that I disagreed with, which is the one here, as well as one that I agreed with a bit lower down, which I'll get to a bit later. But here we have Kevin Labanc on the second line. Now, this was a second line that was put together at the beginning of the Philadelphia Flyers game, and they looked quite good in that one. Granlund, Duclair, Labanc, some solid chemistry going on in that Philly game. And in the first period of this one, I thought that was also the very same fact. This line was getting some strong offensive zone shifts, and that is a major thing for the San Jose Sharks. They have been having so many issues scoring, so you would think you would want strong offensive zone shifts, but it seems as though because this line also did get hemmed into their own zone on one particular shift where it lasted a good like 90 seconds, if not close to 2 minutes, that David Quinn felt the need to make some sort of change. And when it comes to changing up a lineup, you know that the obvious suspect for that is going to be Kevin Labanc. And so in the second period, he gets dropped down to the fourth line in favor of Luke Cunnin. And while I don't think that line after was necessarily that much worse, I was still not particularly happy to see Labanc get demoted for seemingly no reason, especially since the fact that those three players seemingly were beginning to develop some level of chemistry, which, as I mentioned earlier on, is something that the Sharks have been struggling to find through the first 13 games of this season. So I don't really think Cunnin is a fit for the second line. We already seen him in that type of role early on in the season, and it didn't work. So I don't know why you would try to like torpedo the offensive capabilities of this second line, yet here we are. The other two players on this line, when it comes to Granlund and Duclair, Granlund had struggles in this game, as I mentioned. early on. The Sharks didn't actually get too many power plays in this one, but in the third period they managed to get a couple, and on the first one Granlund was an absolute disaster, giving the puck away not once, not twice, but 3 different times, preventing the Sharks from getting ever settled in the offensive zone on that power play and pretty much just wasting the entirety of it. So that was a bit awkward, but at even strength Granlund was definitely pretty good, but it seemed as though once Cunnin arrived on the line there were a couple of chances to come, but not a ton, and the same would go for Anthony Duclair as well, though without the sort of power play caveat. Then when it comes to the third line, here is where we had the second swap, the one that I did agree with. I was rather critical of the third line last game. Zadina, Sturm, and Hoffman were pretty invisible in that one, and here tonight in particular, the player who had probably the worst game out of all the forwards for the San Jose Sharks was absolutely Mike Hoffman. Now through the first few games of the season, the few dozen games of the season, he was a healthy scratch in one of them, but otherwise, while he wasn't really doing anything offensively positive for the San Jose Sharks, he also wasn't that much of a liability. His defensive game came advertised as really, really bad, but it didn't seem to reach that level at any point. Here tonight, it absolutely did. Hoffman was an absolute disaster in the defensive zone, and David Quinn became aware of that seemingly by the third period because he got dropped down to the fourth line, and I don't even know if he actually took many shifts at all in the third period at that point, and so getting bumped up to the third line was actually Ryan Carpenter. But before I get to his performance, I will talk about Sturm and Zadina. Both of those players seemingly got a lot better once they were actually separated from Hoffman, because through the first couple of periods they really didn't do much of anything. They were okay-ish defensively, at least in comparison to Hoffman, who they found themselves on the ice with primarily through those first couple of periods. But once the third period rolled around and they got their new line mate, they definitely looked a lot better. And as I mentioned, Zadina getting that goal ended up being the game winner for the night. But let's actually talk about the player who was bumped up to this third line. That was Ryan Carpenter. He was not particularly noticeable through the first couple of periods in this one. He had a couple of really good looks with Kevin Labanc once Labanc was bumped down to the fourth line about in the second period, so that was nice to see. But Carpenter really began to shine in the third period once he got bumped up to that third line. A great play that led to the Zadina goal as he ended up getting a secondary assist there, but a couple of other very strong efforts to get the Sharks and that third line some breath of life in them because of just how ineffective they had previously been when Hoffman was in that role. So Hoffman kind of now in an awkward spot because I don't really want to see him be playing on the fourth line, and clearly he has kind of lost his spot on the third line. So is he a potential healthy scratch target for the San Jose Sharks? Perhaps. We'll see if the Sharks will really have anyone to even step in to that particular role if they want to. And then when it comes to the other couple of players on the fourth line here, as I sort of already talked about, Cunnin didn't really do anything when he was on the fourth line. The second line, he obviously got his chances primarily because he was playing with Granlund and Duclair, but otherwise didn't exactly do a ton. And then when it comes to Giovanni Smith, he was also he was definitely not as bad as Hoffman, as though he didn't stand out in such an awful way, but he was probably the most unnoticeable player of the night. I barely even could tell that Smith was playing in this game. And then we have the defense, and of course the spotlight here tonight was on the newest addition to the San Jose Sharks roster, Kalen Addison, picked up in a trade just yesterday from the Minnesota Wild and was brought in to be an offensive guy and primarily a power play guy for the San Jose Sharks. So let's first mention the power play. As I talked about, the Sharks got 2 power plays tonight in this game. The first one was practically wasted all by Mikael Granlund, but the second one not as much, and yet they still couldn't get anything really generated in the offensive zone. I'm not actually going to blame Addison for that. I thought he did an okay job and in his role. It's just the forwards couldn't really ever get anything settled, and so I'm not going to put any blame on him there. But when it comes to his even strength play, you could definitely tell that there were that his first instinct is offensive play. In particular, there were a couple of plays in the first period, first of which where you think that the simple play is for him to just dump the puck in, and probably every other defenseman on the Sharks roster would have made exactly that, but instead he patiently holds the puck, and dangerously, I should also add, holds the puck, but it works out. He's able to make a nice little pass near the offensive blue line, and it ends up amounting not to a great chance for the Sharks, but a bit of zone time for them at the very least. A second one, and this one goes more poorly, is him him aggressively joining the rush on a play in which ends up being a turnover the other way, which leads to a 2-on-1 for the Oilers. They do not get punished for this 2-on-1, but still very dangerous. And again, something that you probably would not have seen any other defenseman on the Sharks actually do in that particular situation. So I do definitely like that Addison is going for these offensive chances, but it didn't really pay off at all in tonight's game, and so you didn't exactly get to an opportunity to see him shine. One thing that I will mention, it comes to his defensive play. Many people were saying that he, as a defenseman, was not particularly good in his own zone, and I did notice occasionally himself kind of floating around a bit, which is not a great sign, but I don't think he was nearly as bad as some may have said. When it comes to his partner Ferraro had a bit of issues tonight, a couple of shifts which ended up going extremely long, issues clearing the zone, and when he had those opportunities, he would occasionally ice the puck, which was not a great thing because that just further extends his shifts on the ice, and so defensively, not so great. When it comes to the second pairing here of Vlasic and Burrows, the good news, Vlasic was not as much of a disaster as he was against the Philadelphia Flyers. The bad news is that he still wasn't really all that good. Vlasic just kind of outpaced against a pretty fast team like the Edmonton Oilers, and while positionally I thought he was relatively sound, it still wasn't exactly a positive performance from him, and the same could be said by Burrows, not exactly the same justifications. I thought Burrows was actually positionally quite sound and really not that bad in this game, but again, maybe not shining as much as he was early on in this season. And then when it comes to the final pairing here tonight, Ruda and Okotiuk, this was a pairing that I was indeed impressed with once again. Ruda seemingly has found a home here on this third pairing with Okotiuk after a really struggling start to the season where Ruda looked like the worst defenseman for the Sharks, even somehow finding himself below Vlasic almost on the depth charts. He has rebounded significantly to look serviceable in this role. And Okotiuk, I had mentioned he had a bit of a hit or miss game, moments where he didn't look all that great last game. This tonight was much more of a hit than it was a miss. Very strong game for him, and it's nice to see him actually perform, considering some people, or including myself, were not super impressed with the return of that Timo Meier trade, but now that Zetterlund seems to be working out well, Okotiuk seems to be a decent option at the NHL level, it's definitely beginning to look a lot better now this year. And then finally, we have the goaltender for the Sharks. It is Blackwood once again, and once again, he puts up an absolutely stellar performance here tonight. Some fantastic saves. He had absolutely zero chance on the Nugent-Hopkins goal. Technically had a chance on the Nurse goal, but a 2-on-1. I'm not going to put too much blame onto Blackwood. And he otherwise managed to make tons of great saves, including on those fantastic players I mentioned earlier, like McDavid and Draisaitl. And this is actually a back-to-back situation for the San Jose Sharks. So it seems as though Kakinen will end up getting the much more difficult start tomorrow, because that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action, as I say, tomorrow against the defending Stanley Cup champion Vegas Golden Knights. The Sharks have played against them once before this season. It was the first game of the year in which they lost 4-1 that Kakinen also started, but now that the Sharks have some confidence in their game, they're now 2-0 in their last two games. Perhaps they can get a bit of a win streak rolling. Class dismissed.